Left with nothing but her children, she found hope in the hands of a quiet drover who wouldn't leave her side. Introduction. The Australian Outback has always been a land that tests the soul. Beneath the endless canopy of stars and scorching sun, where the redo stretches beyond the horizon and the silence can drive a person to madness, it demands everything from those who dare to call it home. It strips away pretense, reveals character, and either breaks you completely or forges you into something stronger than you ever imagined possible. In the winter of 1897, when the morning frost painted the Spinifex grass silver, and the wind carried the scent of eucalyptus across the vast expanse of South Australia's pastoral country, there lived a woman whose story would echo through the generations. Her name was Maggie O'Brien, though most folks simply called her Maggie, and she had found herself in that terrible, familiar position that so many women of the frontier knew too well, utterly alone, with nothing but her children and a stubborn determination to survive another day. The homestead where Maggie lived with her 3 young ones sat like a weathered sentinel against the endless sky, its corrugated iron roof catching the light of dawn and holding onto the warmth long after the sun had set. The nearest neighbor was 30 miles through bush tracks that could swallow a person whole, and the closest town, Cooper Creek, was a 2-day ride on horseback, if the weather held and the creek wasn't running high. Her husband, Thomas, had been gone for 6 months now. Not gone in the way that men sometimes leave their family for the goldfields or the promise of greener pastures, but gone in the way that the Outback claims its own. A snakebite while mending fence line had taken him in 3 agonizing days, leaving Maggie with 7-year-old Sarah, 5-year-old William, and baby James, who had just learned to walk on unsteady legs around the rough-hewn furniture of their simple home. The isolation pressing on her like a weight she could barely lift each morning. There were moments, in the deep quiet before dawn when even the kookaburras hadn't begun their raucous laughter, that Maggie wondered if she had the strength to face another day. The sheep still needed tending. The vegetable garden required constant attention in the unforgiving soil, and the children needed their mother to be strong when she felt anything but. It was on a morning in late July, when the frost hung thick on the water trough and her breath misted in the cold air, that she first saw him, a lone figure on horseback, moving slowly along the track that passed by their property. Most travelers kept moving. There was nothing at the O'Brien homestead to interest a stranger, and Maggie had learned to be wary of men who rode alone through the bush. But this one was different. He stopped at the gate, sitting easy in his saddle while his horse, a sturdy bay gelding, stamped impatiently in the cold. He was tall and lean, with the weathered look of a man who had spent his life under the Australian sun. His akubra hat was pulled low over eyes that seemed to take in everything, the broken rail in the fence, the way the windmill creaked in the morning breeze, the thin line of smoke rising from the homestead chimney. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the distance that separated the house from the track. Maggie stood on her front porch, one hand shielding her eyes from the low sun, acutely aware of how she must appear, a woman alone, struggling to keep her world from falling apart. The stranger touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was both polite and somehow reassuring, then continued on his way without a word. She didn't know then that this quiet drover, whose name was Daniel McKenzie, would become the answer to prayers she hadn't dared to speak aloud. She couldn't have imagined that in his weathered hands lay not just the skills of a cattleman who knew every water hole and safe passage through hundreds of miles of unforgiving country, but also a gentleness that could coax hope back into a heart that had almost forgotten how to hope. The Outback is a way of bringing people together when they need each other most. Perhaps it's a vast emptiness that makes human connection so precious, or maybe it's simply that in a land where survival depends on more than just individual strength, the universe conspires to place the right people in each other's paths. Whatever the reason, as Maggie watched that lone rider disappear into the morning haze, something in her chest, something that had been closed tight since Thomas died, began to loosen just slightly. This is a story of how love can bloom in the most unexpected places, how hope can return when all seems lost, and how sometimes the very land that breaks us can also heal us. It's a tale of resilience that speaks to every woman who has ever had to find strength she didn't know she possessed, who has ever had to rebuild her life from nothing but determination and the unwavering love for her children. In a world that moves so fast we barely have time to catch our breath. Stories like Maggie's remind us of the enduring power of human connection and the quiet strength that can emerge from life's greatest challenges. If this tale of love and resilience in the Australian Outback touches your heart, I invite you to subscribe to hear more stories of courage and hope from times when life moved at a gentler pace, and to give this video a like if you believe in the power of second chances. Now, let us return to that winter morning in 1897, when a quiet drover would change everything for a woman who thought her story was already over. Chapter 1. The Weight of Solitude. The days that followed that first encounter moved with the slow, relentless rhythm of frontier life. Maggie rose before dawn each morning, as she had done since becoming a wife at 18 and a mother at 19. But now, at 26, she rose not to the gentle stirring of her husband preparing for another day of station work, but to the sound of baby James crying for his breakfast and the older children beginning to stir in their shared bedroom. The routine was both her salvation and her prison. Water to be drawn from the well, the fire to be stoked in the wood stove, porridge to be stirred while she listened for the sounds that might mean trouble, a break in the fence, a predator near the chickens, or worse, the sound of approaching horsemen with unclear intentions. In this isolated corner of South Australia, being a woman alone made her vulnerable in ways that kept her awake at night, staring at the rifle mounted above the fireplace and praying she would never need to use it. Sarah, her eldest, had grown serious beyond her 7 years. She helped without being asked, settling young William with his breakfast while Maggie tended to the baby. The little girl's eyes, so like her father's deep brown, held a gravity that broke Maggie's heart. Children shouldn't have to grow up so quickly, but the Outback demanded maturity from everyone, regardless of age. "Mama," Sarah said one morning, her small voice careful in the way children's voices become when they are trying to protect their parents from worry. "The big ram is limping again." Maggie looked up from where she was changing James's nappy, made from flour sacks that she had sewn and resewn until they were soft enough for a baby skin. The ram Sarah was referring to was the leader of their small flock, and if he was injured, it could mean disaster for their livelihood. The sheep were what stood between them and complete destitution, providing wool that could be sold in town and meat when times were particularly hard. "We'll check on him after breakfast," Maggie said, keeping her voice steady even as her mind raced through the problems a lame ram could create. How would she manage to examine the animal alone? Thomas had always handled the larger sheep, with his strong hands and confident manner that kept the animals calm. She had helped, certainly, but now the full responsibility fell on her shoulders. After settling the children with their morning chores, Sarah to collect eggs from the chickens, William to stack firewood by the back door under his sister's watchful eye, and baby James secured in the rough wooden playpen Thomas had built, Maggie made her way to the sheep yard behind the house. The ram stood apart from the small flock, favoring his left front leg in a way that made Maggie's heart sink. She had no money for a veterinarian, even if she could get one to come this far out, and her knowledge of animal doctoring was limited to the basic remedies any station wife learned by necessity. She was circling the enclosure, trying to figure out how to safely separate and examine the animal, when she heard the sound of approaching hooves. Her hand instinctively moved to the pocket where she kept the small revolver Thomas had insisted she carry, but as the rider came into view, she recognized the same quiet figure who had passed by several days earlier. The drover set his horse with the easy confidence of a man who had spent more years in the saddle than on foot. Up close, she could see that his clothes were well-worn but clean, his boots practical rather than fancy, and his gear spoke of long experience on the trail. Most telling of all, his horse, that sturdy bay gelding, looked well cared for, its coat glossy despite the rigors of constant travel. "Morning," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was quiet, with a slight drawl of someone who chose his words carefully. "Couldn't help but notice you might have a problem with one of your sheep." Maggie felt heat rise in her cheeks. It was one thing to struggle in private. It was another entirely to have a stranger witness her helplessness. "The ram seems to have injured his leg," she said, lifting her chin in the way women do when they are determined not to show weakness. "I was just assessing the situation." Something that might have been a smile flickered at the corner of his mouth, but his expression remained respectful. "Name's Daniel McKenzie," he said, dismounting with fluid ease. "Been droving cattle through this country for near on 15 years. Picked up a thing or two about animal doctoring along the way." He approached the fence slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The sheep, which had been skittish with Maggie nearby, seemed to calm in his presence. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked. Sometimes a fresh set of eyes can see what's troubling an animal. Maggie wanted to refuse, to maintain her independence and prove that she could handle everything herself. But as baby James began to fuss from his playpen and she saw Sarah watching anxiously from the chicken yard, practicality won over pride. "I would be grateful for your opinion, Mr. McKenzie," she said. What happened next was like watching a master craftsman at work. Daniel entered the sheep yard with a confidence that immediately communicated to the animals that he belonged there. He moved slowly, speaking in low tones that seemed to settle the entire flock. When he approached the injured ram, the animal actually stood still, as if understanding that this human meant to help rather than harm. "Just a stone bruise," Daniel said after careful examination, his large hands gentle as he lifted and inspected the ram's hoof. Picked up a sharp rock between his toes. Painful, but not serious. He produced a worn pocket knife and, with practiced skill, removed the offending stone. "He'll be right as rain in a day or two." The relief that flooded through Maggie was so intense it made her knees weak. What had seemed like a potential catastrophe was, in the hands of someone with knowledge and experience, merely a minor setback. "Thank you," she said, and the gratitude in her voice was profound. I don't know what I would have done." Daniel straightened, wiping his hands on a rag he pulled from his pocket. "Station life's not meant to be managed alone," he said, and there was no judgment in his voice, only understanding. "Takes a community to make it work, even out here where neighbors are few and far between." As if summoned by his words, Sarah appeared at Maggie's side, having abandoned her egg-collecting duties to investigate the stranger who had helped their ram. She studied Daniel with the serious attention children reserve for adults who might prove important in their lives. "Are you a cowbay?" she asked with a directness that only children possess. Daniel crouched down to bring himself to her eye level, a gesture that immediately endeared him to Maggie. "I'm a drover," he said seriously. "I move cattle from one place to another, across all the country between here and the Queensland border." "What's your name, little miss?" "Sarah O'Brien," she replied. "This is our station. Mama takes care of us and the sheep all by herself now." The simple statement hung in the air between the adults, carrying weight far beyond the child's understanding. Daniel's eyes met Maggie's over Sarah's head, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. Not pity, which he had dreaded encountering, but recognition. The look of someone who understood what it meant to carry responsibilities that seemed too heavy for any one person to bear. "Your mama must be very brave," he said to Sarah, but his eyes remained on Maggie. "And very strong." "She is," Sarah agreed matter-of-factly. "She can shoot a rifle and everything. Papa taught her before he went to heaven." The child's casual reference to her father's death brought a familiar ache to Maggie's chest, but she noticed that Daniel didn't flinch or offer the awkward condolences that most people seem compelled to provide. Instead, he nodded solemnly to Sarah. "That's a good skill for anyone to have out here," he said. "Shows wisdom." He stood then, settling his hat more firmly on his head, a gesture that Maggie was beginning to recognize as his way of signaling the end of a conversation. But instead of the immediate departure she expected, he paused. "I'll be moving through this country regular-like over the next few months," he said, addressing his words to a point somewhere between Maggie and the horizon. "Got a contract to move cattle for several stations. If you ever have need of anything, repairs, animal troubles, supplies from town, well, a neighbor's always welcome to ask for help." The offer was made casually, as if it cost him nothing, but Maggie understood the significance of what he was proposing. In a land where the nearest settlement was days away and help could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe, he was offering to be her safety net. "That's very kind," she managed, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what he was offering. Daniel mounted his horse with the same easy grace he had shown in everything else, gathering the reins in hands that she noticed were scarred from years of hard work. "No kindness to it," he said. "Just the way things should be done out here." He touched his hat brim again, this time including Sarah in his farewell nod, and rode away at the same unhurried pace that had first brought him into their lives. Maggie stood watching until he disappeared over the rise that led to the main track, Sarah's small hand finding hers as they stood together in the morning sun. That evening, after the children were settled in their beds and the house had fallen into the deep quiet that came with nightfall in the outback, Maggie sat by the kitchen window with her mending. But instead of focusing on the Tay and William's shirt that needed patching, she found herself staring out at the track where Daniel McKenzie had appeared that morning like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. For the first time since Thomas died, the weight of her solitude didn't feel quite so crushing. Somewhere out there in the vast darkness, moving cattle through country that could be both beautiful and brutal, was a man who understood that survival wasn't a solitary endeavor. He had seen her struggle and offered help without making her feel diminished by her need for it. As she worked her needle through the worn fabric of her son's shirt, Maggie allowed herself to wonder what it might mean to have someone she could count on again. Not in the way she had counted on Thomas, as a wife counts on a husband, but in the way that people who understood the challenges of frontier life could support each other through the inevitable hardships that lay ahead. The thought both comforted and frightened her. She had grown protective of the small, fragile world she had built for her children, suspicious of anyone who might threaten their security or bring complications into their carefully ordered existence. But Daniel McKenzie hadn't felt like a threat. He had felt like possibility. Outside her window, a curlew called into the night, its haunting cry echoing across the plains. Somewhere in the distance, another answered, and Maggie found herself thinking about the way isolated souls sometimes found each other in the vast emptiness of the Australian bush. Perhaps, she thought as she set aside her mending and prepared for bed, even the most solitary of lives could benefit from an unexpected connection. The ram was sound by morning, walking without favoring his injured leg, and Maggie found herself looking toward the track more often than was strictly necessary as she went about her daily chores. She told herself it was simple vigilance, keeping watch for travelers as any sensible woman living alone would do. But in her heart, she knew she was hoping to catch another glimpse of the quiet drover who had made her problems seem smaller and her world feel a little less empty. Chapter 2. Weathering the Storm. 3 weeks passed before Daniel McKenzie appeared on the track again, and by then Maggie had begun to wonder if their encounter had been a dream born of a desperate need for adult companionship. The isolation had been pressing in on her more heavily than usual. Long days when the only voices she heard were those of her children, and the conversations that sustained her were about simple things. What to have for dinner, which chores needed doing, whether the weather would hold for hanging washing on the line. She had just finished the morning milking, her hands aching from working the stubborn cow that Thomas had optimistically named Gentle but who had proven to be anything but, when she heard the familiar sound of hooves on the hard-packed earth of the track. This time, Daniel wasn't alone. He was leading a small mob of cattle, perhaps 30 head, their red and white hides dusty from the trail. 2 other men rode with him, stockmen by the look of them, with the easy manner of men accustomed to spending weeks in each other's company on the trail. They raised their hands in greeting as they passed, but it was Daniel who separated from the group and rode toward the homestead. "Morning, Mrs. O'Brien," he called, and Maggie felt an unexpected warmth at hearing her name spoken by someone other than her children. "Wondered if we might water the cattle at your bore? Happy to pay the usual rate." The request was a common courtesy between travelers and station owners, though Maggie had rarely been asked since Thomas died. Most drovers preferred to deal with men, and her homestead was small enough that it could easily be bypassed in favor of larger stations with better facilities. "Of course," she replied, though she had no idea what the usual rate might be. Thomas had always handled such business arrangements. "The bore's running well, and the trough is clean." As Daniel directed his companions toward the water source, Maggie noticed that the cattle were in excellent condition despite their obvious time on the trail. Their eyes were bright, their coats healthy, and they moved with the easy contentment of animals that had been well cared for. It spoke to Daniel's skill as a drover that he could maintain a mob in such good shape across hundreds of miles of challenging country. Sarah and William had appeared from their morning play, drawn by the excitement of visitors and the magnificent sight of the cattle. They pressed against the fence, watching with fascination as the animals spread out around the trough, their long tongues lapping greedily at the clear water. "Stay well back from the fence," Maggie called to them, but Daniel was already dismounting near where the children stood. "They are gentle enough," he said to Sarah and William, "but it's always wise to respect any animal that size. A cow that weighs 5 times what you do can hurt you without meaning to." He pointed to a particularly large bull in the mob. "See that old fellow with the white face? He's the leader. The others follow him, so at his calm, they'll be calm too." William, who had just turned 5 and was at the age where everything interested him intensely, pressed closer to the fence. "Where are you taking them?" he asked. "Down to the sale yards in Adelaide," Daniel replied, settling into the easy conversation he seemed to have with all children. "They'll be sold to people who need cattle for their own stations. Will you bring them back?" Sarah wanted to know. Daniel's smile was gentle. "No, little miss. Once they are sold, they become someone else's responsibility. But I'll be back through this way with different cattle, moving them from stations up north to buyers down south. It's what I do, help get animals from where they are to where they need to be." As the cattle drank and rested in whatever shade they could find, Daniel's companions remained respectfully distant, understanding without being told that this was more than a simple business transaction. Maggie found herself walking with him as he checked the water flow and assessed the condition of his animals. "You've got a good setup here," he said, nodding toward the neat vegetable garden and the well-maintained chicken coop. "Takes considerable work to keep a place running smooth as this." The compliment warmed her in a way that surprised her with its intensity. It had been so long since anyone had noticed her efforts, acknowledged the countless small tasks that kept their world functioning. "It's what needs doing," she said, but she couldn't keep the pleasure from her voice. "Doesn't make it less of an accomplishment," Daniel replied. "I've seen plenty of stations that didn't run half as well with twice the hands to do the work." They were interrupted by baby James, who had awakened from his morning nap and was making his displeasure known from inside the house. Maggie hurried to fetch him, and when she returned with a child on her hip, she found Daniel crouched by the vegetable garden, examining her tomato plants with the focused attention of someone who understood growing things. "You've got red spider starting on these," he said, straightening as she approached. "Notice it on the undersides of the leaves. If you don't treat it soon, it'll spread to the whole crop." Maggie's heart sank. The vegetable garden was crucial to their survival, providing fresh food that supplemented their limited supplies and helped stretch their meager resources through the lean months. Losing the tomato crop would mean a significant hardship. "I don't know much about plant diseases," she admitted. "Thomas always handled the garden troubles." Daniel was quiet for a moment, and she could see him weighing his words. "There's a remedy," he said finally. "Soap and water, applied regular-like. But it takes time and attention to be effective." The unspoken implication hung between them, time and attention that she was already struggling to find for all the tasks that demanded her focus. Between caring for 3 young children, maintaining the livestock, keeping the house running, and all the other responsibilities of station life, there weren't enough hours in the day for everything that needed doing. "I could show you the mixture," Daniel offered. "Get you started on the treatment before we move on." The kindness of the gesture struck her almost speechless. Here was a man with his own responsibilities, his own schedule to keep, offering to delay his journey to help solve her problem. "I couldn't ask you to," she began, but he held up a weathered hand. "Not asking, offering," he said simply. "Won't take but an hour, and it might save your whole crop." What followed was one of the most peaceful hours Maggie had experienced since becoming a widow. While his companions dozed in whatever shade they could find and the cattle rested after they drink, Daniel worked alongside her in the garden, showing her how to mix the soap solution and demonstrating the careful technique needed to treat the affected plants without damaging them. Baby James sat contentedly on a blanket nearby, entertained by the novelty of watching adults work together, while Sarah and William helped by bringing water from a well and generally making themselves useful in the way children do when they sense that something important is happening. "The trick is to get the undersides of the leaves," Daniel explained, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he showed her the proper technique. "That's where the mites hide. Miss them, and they'll just spread to new growth." Working beside him, Maggie became acutely aware of his quiet competence. Every movement was economical and purposeful, born of years of experience with growing things and caring for them. His presence was calming in a way that she had almost forgotten was possible. The simple comfort of sharing a task with someone who understood what needed doing and how to do it well. "You've saved my tomatoes," she said as they finished treating the last plant, and the gratitude in her voice was profound. "We've saved them," he corrected gently. "You'll need to keep up the treatment for the next few weeks. Every third day, weather permitting." As his companions began to stir and prepare for the continuation of their journey, Daniel walked with Maggie to where the cattle were gathering, ready to move out. The animals seemed to know the routine, falling into line behind their lead bull with the practiced ease of long experience on the trail. "Mrs. O'Brien," he said as he prepared to mount his horse, and there was something in his voice that made her look up sharply. "There's weather coming in from the west. Big storm, by the look of it. You might want to make sure everything's battened down tight." Maggie looked toward the western horizon, which appeared clear and bright to her inexperienced eye. But Daniel read the sky with the skill of someone whose life depended on understanding weather patterns, and she had already learned to trust his judgment. "How long do you think?" she asked. "Tomorrow, maybe the day after," he replied, settling into his saddle. "Could be a rough one. These autumn storms sometimes are." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something internal. "If you need anything, if there's trouble, fire a shot in the air. 3 shots, space apart. I'll be camped about 5 miles south of here tonight, and the sound carries far in this country." The offer was made casually, but Maggie understood its significance. In a land where help could be days away, he was promising to be her safety net if the storm proved too much for her to handle alone. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried weight far beyond their simple syllables. Daniel touched his hat in the gesture she was coming to know well, and rode away with his cattle and companions. Maggie stood watching until they disappeared over the rise, baby James heavy in her arms and the older children pressed against her sides like bookends. The storm Daniel had predicted arrived 36 hours later with a violence that shook the very foundations of the homestead. It began with a hot, dry wind that set everything rattling and moaning, followed by a wall of black clouds that blotted out the afternoon sun and turned day to night in minutes. When the rain came, it came all at once, as if someone had overturned a vast bucket in the sky. The drops were huge and hard, striking the roof with such force that normal conversation became impossible. Lightning split the darkness with jagged brilliance, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the earth itself. Maggie gathered the children in the main room, as far from the windows as possible, and tried to project calm while her heart raced with each new crash of thunder. Sarah huddled close, trying to comfort baby James, who wailed at each lightning flash, while William pressed himself against Maggie's other side, his small body trembling with each thunderclap. The wind rose to a howl that seemed to come from every direction at once, rattling the windows and their frames and finding every loose board or piece of corrugated iron on the property. Maggie could hear things being torn away and hurled across the yard. The chicken coop door, she thought, and possibly some of the fence rails that had been loose since winter. As the hours passed and the storm showed no signs of abating, Maggie began to worry about more serious damage. Water was coming in around the edges of the windows, pooling on the wooden floor despite her efforts to stuff rags into the gaps. The wind had found a loose piece of roofing iron and was worrying it like a terrier with a rat, each gust lifting it and slamming it back down with a crash that made the children flinch. It was during a brief lull in the storm's fury that she heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold. The distinctive crack and groan of wood under stress, followed by a tremendous crash that shook the entire house. Something major had given way, and from the direction of the sound, she feared it was part of the roof over the kitchen. "Stay here," she told the children, settling baby James in Sarah's lap. "Don't move from this spot." She grabbed the oil lamp and made her way through the house, water squelching under her feet from the leaks that had developed throughout the building. When she reached the kitchen, her worst fears were confirmed. A section of the roof had given way under the weight of water and the constant battering of the wind, leaving a gaping hole that let in rain and wind with equal fury. Water was pouring in, soaking everything it touched and threatening to spread to the rest of the house. If she couldn't find a way to stop it, they would lose not just the kitchen but potentially their entire home. And in this country, losing your shelter in winter meant losing everything. Maggie stood in the doorway, lamp held high, trying to think through the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. She needed something to cover the hole, and she needed help to secure it against the wind. But she was alone, 30 miles from the nearest neighbor, with 3 small children depending on her to solve a problem that would challenge a crew of experienced men. It was then that she remembered Daniel's words, 3 shots, spaced apart. He had promised to listen for a signal, promised to come if she needed help. But did she dare? The storm was at its height, and asking him to ride through this chaos seemed like asking too much of anyone. Another section of roofing iron tore away with a screech of metal, and more water poured through the damaged roof. The decision was made for her. This was beyond what she could handle alone, and pride was a luxury she couldn't afford when her children's safety was at stake. She made her way to the rifle mounted above the fireplace, checked that it was loaded, and stepped onto the covered porch. The wind immediately tried to tear the weapon from her hands, and rain lashed at her face with stinging force. But she braced herself, raised the rifle skyward, and fired the first shot into the storm. The sound was swallowed almost immediately by the wind and thunder, and for a moment she wondered if it would carry at all in such conditions. But she fired twice more, spacing the shots as Daniel had instructed, then retreated into the house to wait and pray that someone had heard her desperate signal. 20 minutes later, through the howl of wind and the drumming of rain on what remained of her roof, she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, hoofbeats approaching at a gallop through the storm. She peered through the window and saw a rider approaching, bent low over his horse's neck, pushing through the tempest with single-minded determination. Daniel had come. Despite the danger, despite the brutal conditions, despite having every reason to stay safe and dry wherever he had taken shelter, he had heard her shots and come riding through the storm to help. He burst through the kitchen door like a force of nature himself, water streaming from his oilskin coat and hat. His eyes immediately found the gaping hole in the roof and the water pouring through it, and she saw his jaw tighten as he assessed the damage. "Canvas," he said, having to shout over the storm. "You got canvas? Tarpaulin? Anything waterproof?" Maggie nodded, leading him to the storage room where Thomas had kept supplies. Together they dragged out a heavy canvas tarpaulin that had been used to cover hay during transport. It was barely large enough for the job, but it would have to do. What followed was one of the most dangerous and exhausting hours of Maggie's life. Working together in the storm, the wind trying to tear the canvas from their hands and rain making every surface treacherously slippery, they managed to wrestle the tarpaulin into position over the damaged section of roof. Daniel climbed onto the wet, wind-lashed roof itself to secure the canvas with ropes and nails, while Maggie held the bottom edge against the fierce wind from inside the house. Several times she was certain he would be blown off entirely, but he moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone accustomed to working in all conditions, and gradually the makeshift repair took shape. By the time they finished, both were soaked to the skin and exhausted, but the emergency flow of water into the kitchen had been reduced to a manageable leak. The house was saved, and with it their home and security. "It'll hold until the storm passes," Daniel said, wringing water from his hat. "Won't be pretty, but it'll keep the worst of the weather out." Maggie wanted to thank him, wanted to find words adequate for what he had just done, but she found herself suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of it all. Without his help, she would have lost everything. The house, their possessions, possibly even their lives if the roof had continued to fail. "I don't know how to repay you," she managed, her voice thick with emotion and exhaustion. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes serious in the lamplight. "No repayment needed," he said quietly. "This is what neighbors do for each other." But even as he said it, they both knew this had gone beyond simple neighborly assistance. He had risked his life riding through a storm that could easily have killed him, had worked for hours in conditions that would have challenged the strongest men, all because he had heard her call for help. As the storm finally began to subside in the early hours of morning, Daniel sat at a kitchen table, accepting the hot tea and simple meal she had managed to prepare despite the chaos. The children had finally fallen asleep, exhausted by the night's terrors, and for the first time in hours, the house was quiet except for the steady drip of water from a makeshift repairs. "The storm's breaking," he said, nodding toward the window where the first gray light of dawn was beginning to show through the clouds. "Should be clear by noon. Will you stay?" The words escaped before Maggie could stop them, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I mean, until the weather clears. You shouldn't ride out in what's left of this storm." Daniel studied her face for a moment, and she had the unsettling feeling that he could see more than she intended to reveal. The offer to stay was practical, sensible even, but there was something in her voice that spoke of more than simple concern for his safety. "I'll stay until the repairs can be made proper," he said finally. "House needs more work than that canvas can provide long-term." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by a flutter of something that felt dangerously like anticipation. Having Daniel McKenzie under her roof, even temporarily, would change the careful balance of a solitary life in ways she wasn't sure she was ready to examine. But as she looked around at the water damage and the temporary repairs that were all that stood between her family and the elements, she knew that some changes were necessary for survival. And perhaps, she thought as she watched this quiet man who had ridden through a storm to help her, some changes might even be welcome. The morning brought clear skies and the kind of crisp wash that only came after a major storm. Daniel was up before dawn, assessing the damage by daylight, and making lists of what would be needed to restore the homestead to proper condition. The roof repairs were more extensive than Maggie had feared, requiring not just new iron but replacement of several damaged support beams. "It's a good week's work," he said over breakfast, speaking carefully as if he understood the implications of what he was suggesting. "Maybe more, depending on what we find when we start pulling things apart." The children had warmed to his presence with the easy acceptance of youth. Sarah hung on his every word as he explained what the repairs would involve, while William appointed himself as Daniel's assistant, following him around the property with determined steps and asking endless questions about everything he saw. Even baby James seemed to respond to Daniel's quiet presence, settling more easily when the tall man was nearby and watching him with the intense focus that very young children reserve for people who interest them. "I have some money put by," Maggie said, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty about whether it would be enough. "From selling wool last season. I can pay for materials and your time." Daniel waved off a concern with a gesture that was becoming familiar. "Materials? Yes, time's freely given. Can't charge a neighbor for lending a hand." The word neighbor hung in the air between them, carrying implications that went far beyond simple geography. In the vast emptiness of the outback, neighbors were more than people who happened to live nearby. They were lifelines, connections that could mean the difference between thriving and merely surviving. Over the following days, as Daniel worked to repair the storm damage, Maggie found herself settling into a rhythm that felt both foreign and surprisingly natural. Having another adult to share the daily responsibilities transformed the weight of station life from something that threatened to crush her into something manageable, even pleasant. He worked with the quiet efficiency she was coming to recognize as his hallmark, but he also brought a presence that filled spaces in her life she hadn't realized were empty. Conversation at meals, another voice joining in the children's bedtime stories, someone to discuss the small decisions that made up the fabric of daily life. The vegetable gardens responding well to the treatment. He said one evening as they sat on the porch after the children were asleep, watching the stars emerge in the clear sky. "Another week of applications, and you should have the mites under control." Maggie nodded, but her attention was less on the garden and more on the man beside her. In the soft light of the oil lamp, she could see the lines that years of outdoor work had etched around his eyes, the way his hands, scarred from countless small injuries, rested easily on his knees. There was something fundamentally peaceful about his presence, as if he carried within himself the vast quiet of the country he traveled. "You know a great deal about many things," she said. "Not just cattle and horses, but growing things, fixing things, reading weather." Daniel was quiet for so long that she wondered if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been loneliness. "A man who travels alone learns to be self-sufficient," he said. "No point in being helpless when there's no one around to help." The words carried an echo of her own experience, the hard-won knowledge that came from having to handle everything yourself. But there was something else in his tone, a suggestion of choice rather than circumstance. "Have you always traveled alone?" she asked, then immediately wondered if the question was too personal, too much of an intrusion into privacy he might prefer to keep. But Daniel didn't seem offended by her curiosity. Not always, he said. Had a partner for a few years. Early on. Good man, Jack Morrison. Knew cattle better than anyone I've met before or since. What happened to him? River crossing went wrong. Spring flood. Water running higher and faster than we'd judged. Jack went in after a steer that was struggling, and... Daniel shrugged, but the gesture didn't hide the pain in his voice. Current took them both. Maggie felt her heart clench with sympathy. She understood the particular agony of losing someone suddenly, unexpectedly, to the dangers that lurked always in the background of frontier life. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "Long time ago now," Daniel replied, "but it taught me something about depending too much on other people. Easier to work alone, make decisions alone. No one else to worry about, no one else to lose." The philosophy made sense from a practical standpoint, but as Maggie watched him in the lamplight, she wondered if it had cost him more than he realized. There was something in his manner that spoke of walls carefully constructed and maintained, defenses against the kind of connection that could lead to loss. "Yet here you are," she said softly, "helping a neighbor in need." Daniel turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. "Here I am," he agreed, and his voice carried a note of surprise, as if he was only now realizing the contradiction himself. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and possibilities that neither seemed ready to voice aloud. Then baby James stirred in his sleep from inside the house, making the small sounds that meant he would soon wake for his late feeding. And the spell was broken. "I should check on him," Maggie said, rising from her chair with reluctance. "And I should turn in," Daniel replied. "Early start tomorrow if we want to get those roof beams replaced before the next weather moves through." As Maggie tended to baby James in the quiet of the house, she found herself thinking about Daniel's words and the way he had looked at her in the lamplight. Something was changing between them, something that went beyond simple gratitude for help received or the practical convenience of shared labor. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. She had loved Thomas completely, had never imagined that she could feel that way about another man. But Daniel McKenzie was awakening something in her that she had thought died with her husband. The possibility of partnership, of sharing life's burdens and joys with someone who understood both the hardships and the rewards of the life she had chosen. Outside, she could hear him settling into the small room of the kitchen that had served as storage but which they had cleared to make space for him to sleep. The sounds were quietly domestic, boots being removed, the creak of the narrow bed as he settled for the night. Chapter 3. The Promise of Tomorrow. The roof repairs took 12 days to complete properly, and with each day that passed, the temporary arrangement began to feel less temporary and more like something that could grow into permanence. Daniel worked with the methodical patience of a master craftsman, replacing not just the storm damage but strengthening the entire structure against future weather. "Built to last now," he said on the final day, standing back to admire their work. "Should weather whatever storms come your way." Maggie looked up at the neat lines of new iron, the solid framework beneath, and felt a pang of something that might have been lost. The completion of the repairs meant the end of their reason to share the same roof, to wake each morning to the sound of another adult moving through the house, to share the small intimacies of daily life that she had almost forgotten she missed. "It's beautiful work," she said, and meant it. Under Daniel's skilled hands, the homestead had been transformed from a structure barely holding together into something solid and enduring. "I don't know how to properly thank you." "No thanks needed," he replied, but there was something in his voice that suggested he was wrestling with the same conflicted feelings that had been troubling her sleep. Just good to see it done right. That evening, their last as housemates, they sat on the porch as had become their custom, watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. The children were settled for the night. The day's work was done, and there was a peculiar quality to the quiet that fell between them, the kind of silence that comes when there are important things to be said but neither person knows quite how to begin. "I'll be moving out tomorrow," Daniel said finally, his words carrying an odd formality that hadn't been there in days. "Got cattle to move for the Henderson station, and I've delayed long enough." Maggie nodded, though something in her chest tightened at the thought of returning to the solitary existence she had known before he arrived. Of course. You've given us more time than you could spare already. Maggie. The sound of her given name in his voice made her look up sharply. He had been careful to maintain the formal Mrs. O'Brien throughout their time together, as if the proper address could maintain proper boundaries. The shift to intimacy was as significant as a declaration. Yes. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his hands working restlessly with the brim of his hat. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one was being carefully weighed before release. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said the other night, about traveling alone, about choosing to keep people at arm's length rather than risk losing them." Maggie waited, sensing that something important was coming and not wanting to interrupt the delicate process of whatever he was trying to say. "Maybe," he continued, "maybe there comes a time when the cost of staying alone becomes higher than the risk of caring about someone. Maybe some things are worth the risk." The words hung in the air between them, and Maggie felt her heart begin to beat faster. There was a question in his statement, an invitation that was being offered as tentatively as a wild animal approaching an outstretched hand. "Daniel," she said softly, and saw him respond to the sound of his name in a voice the same way she had responded to hearing hers. "What are you asking me?" He set down his hat and turned to face her fully, and in the fading light she could see the vulnerability that he usually kept so carefully hidden. "I'm asking if you think there might be room in your life for someone who's grown tired of traveling the same tracks alone. Someone who's found something worth staying for." The declaration was so much more than she had dared to hope for, and yet now that it was offered, she found herself frightened by the enormity of what he was suggesting. Not just companionship or partnership, but the complete upheaval of the careful life she had built for herself and her children. "The children," she said, though it was as much a question as a statement. "Love them already," Daniel replied without hesitation. "Sarah's got a mind sharp as a tack, William's got the makings of a fine stockman, and baby James." He smiled, and the expression transformed his usually serious face. "That boy's got a grip that could hold a rope in a cyclone. They're good children, Maggie, credit to their raising." The way he spoke about them, with genuine affection and respect, made something inside her chest warm and expand. She had been so afraid that any man who might be interested in her would see her children as burdens to be tolerated rather than blessings to be cherished. "It wouldn't be easy," she said, still not quite daring to believe what was happening. "Station life is hard on everyone, but especially on someone used to the freedom of the trail." "Been thinking about that too," Daniel said. "Droving's a young man's game, really. All those years of sleeping rough, being away from any kind of home for months at a time. I'm 43, Maggie, old enough to want something more than just the next job, the next trail, the next river to cross." He reached out then, slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and took her hand in both of his. His palms were rough from work, scarred from years of handling rope and dealing with difficult animals, but his touch was gentle. "I could still do some droving," he continued. "Shorter contracts, closer to home. But mostly I'd like to help you build something here. Make this place everything it could be. Raise those children to know they've got someone they can count on. If you'll have me." Maggie looked down at their joined hands, his so much larger than hers, darkened by sun and marked by the honest work of a lifetime. In those scarred fingers she saw strength and gentleness combined, the same qualities that had drawn her to him from their first meeting. "I love Thomas," she said quietly, needing him to understand that what she might feel for him wouldn't diminish what had come before. "I know you did," Daniel replied. "Can see it in the way you've kept his memory alive for the children, in the way you fought to hold onto what he built here. I'm not looking to replace what you had with him. Couldn't if I tried." He paused, his thumbs moving gently across her knuckles in a gesture that was both comforting and intimate. "But maybe," he continued, "maybe there's room for something different. Something new, but just as real." The truth of his words resonated through her like the ring of a well-struck bell. What she felt for Daniel was different from her love for Thomas. Not better or worse, but unique to the man who had inspired it. Thomas had been her first love, the father of her children, the partner of her youth. Daniel represented something else entirely, the possibility of a second chance, a mature love built on mutual respect and shared hardship. The children would need time to adjust, she said, and knew even as she spoke that she was negotiating rather than refusing. All the time they need, Daniel assured her. No rush about anything. I'm not going anywhere. People will talk, she warned. A widow taking up with a drifting stockman. There'll be gossip. Daniel's smile was wry. Let them talk. Anyone who's got nothing better to do than gossip about two people trying to build a decent life together probably needs to find more useful ways to spend their time. His matter-of-fact dismissal of small-town judgment made her smile in return. One of the things she had learned during her months of widowhood was that people's opinions were often less important than they seemed, and that happiness was too precious to sacrifice for the approval of those who had never walked in her shoes. Sarah asked a lot of questions. She said, still testing, still making sure he understood what he was taking on. Good, Daniel replied. Smart children should ask questions. Shows they are thinking about the world around them. William gets into everything. He's at that age where curiosity is stronger than common sense. I was the same way at his age, according to my mother. Drove her nearly to distraction. But it's how children learn. And James? She paused, thinking of her youngest. He's been the baby of the family his whole life. He might not take kindly to sharing attention. Children adapt faster than adults do, mostly, Daniel said. And he'll have a father again, someone to teach him the things boys need to know. That's worth a little adjustment period. A father, the word hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond simple companionship. Daniel wasn't just offering to be a partner. He was offering to step into the role that Thomas's death had left empty, to become the man the children looked to for guidance and protection and love. You're sure? She asked, the question encompassing everything they had discussed and much that remained unspoken. Sure you want to tie yourself down to a woman with 3 children and a struggling station? Sure you're ready to give up the life you've known? Daniel lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so tender that it made her eyes fill with unexpected tears. Maggie, he said, and his voice carried absolute certainty. I've spent 20 years looking for home without even knowing that's what I was searching for. Found it here, with you and the children. Can't think of anywhere else I'd rather be. The simple declaration broke through the last of her reservations, and she felt something that had been held tightly closed in her chest finally open. Then stay, she whispered. Please stay. The kiss that followed was soft and careful, a beginning rather than a conquest. It tasted of hope and possibility, of two people who had learned that life was both fragile and precious, and who had found in each other the courage to risk their hearts once more. When they broke apart, both breathing a little unsteadily, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. There's something else, he said. Something I should tell you. Maggie felt a flutter of anxiety. What? I've got some money put by, he said. Quite a bit, actually. 20 years of saving most of what I owned, with no family to spend it on. Enough to improve this place. Maybe expand the flock, get some decent breeding stock. The revelation stunned her into silence. She had been so focused on what she could offer him, a home, companionship, ready-made family, that it hadn't occurred to her he might bring resources of his own to their partnership. I don't want your money, she said quickly, and saw him smile at the fierce independence in her voice. Our money, he corrected gently. If we are doing this, we are doing it as partners, equal partners. Your land, your children, your knowledge of this particular piece of country, my experience, my contacts in the livestock trade, my savings, all of it shared. The fairness of the arrangement, the way he positioned it as an equal partnership rather than his charity or her dependency, made her love him a little more. This was a man who understood that her pride was as important as her practical needs, who recognized that she had been managing successfully on her own and wasn't looking for someone to rescue her so much as someone to share the journey ahead. The children will need to understand what's happening, she said, her mind already moving to practical considerations. Sarah especially. She's old enough to remember her father clearly, and she's been my little helper since he died. She might see you as an intruder. We'll take it slow with all of them, Daniel agreed. Let them get used to the idea gradually. I'm in no hurry to rush anything. As if summoned by their conversation, baby James chose that moment to wake from his sleep and announce his displeasure to the world. Maggie started to rise, but Daniel was already on his feet. "Let me," he said. "Might as well start getting used to night feedings." Watching this quiet, weathered man lift the son with practiced gentleness, seeing the way James immediately settled against his broad chest, Maggie felt the loss of her fears dissolve. Some things couldn't be forced or planned. They simply were, as natural as breathing, as inevitable as sunrise. The next morning brought a flurry of activity as word spread somehow, as word always did in sparsely populated country, that Daniel McKenzie had decided to stay on at the O'Brien place. The first visitor was Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring station, ostensibly bringing fresh bread but clearly fishing for information about the new arrangement. "Heard you've got help with the repairs," she said, accepting tea in Maggie's kitchen while her eyes catalogued every detail of Daniel's presence. His spare clothes hanging on pegs by the back door, his shaving gear on the kitchen shelf, the extra place setting that had appeared at the table. "Mr. McKenzie has been very helpful," Maggie replied diplomatically, neither confirming nor denying the implications of the older woman's curiosity. "Good thing, too," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Place like this needs a man's touch. Too much for a woman alone, even one as capable as you've proven to be." There was approval in the woman's voice, and Maggie realized that the gossip, when it came, would likely be favorable. The practical-minded people of the Outback understood the harsh realities of frontier life, and most would see Daniel's decision to stay as a sensible solution to a difficult situation rather than anything scandalous. Sarah and William adapted to Daniel's permanent presence with the easy acceptance of children who had grown to trust him during the weeks of roof repairs. They had already incorporated him into their daily routines, seeking him out for advice about everything from the proper way to saddle a horse to the best techniques for skipping stones at the billabong. Baby James, as Daniel had predicted, adapted fastest of all, within days. He was reaching for Daniel as readily as for his mother, babbling contentedly when the tall man carried him around the property on his daily rounds. "Da-da," James said clearly one evening, reaching chubby hands toward Daniel from his high chair, and the word hung in the air like a benediction. Maggie saw tears gather in Daniel's eyes before he blinked them away. "That's right, little man," he said softly, lifting the child into his arms. "Da-da." The wedding, when it came 2 months later, was a simple affair held in the parlor of the Coober Creek parsonage, with Mrs. Patterson and her husband standing as witnesses. Maggie wore her best dress, the blue wool that Thomas had bought her for their 5th anniversary, and Daniel wore a new shirt that he had ordered specially from Adelaide. Sarah and William stood solemnly beside their mother, while baby James, now toddling confidently, explored the unfamiliar room with the fearless curiosity of childhood. When the minister asked if there were any objections to the union, William piped up in his clear child voice, "I object to having to wear these tight shoes." The laughter that followed broke the formal tension and reminded everyone present that this was, above all, the joining of a family. The ceremony was brief, the words familiar, but when Daniel slipped a simple gold band onto Maggie's finger and promised to love and protect her and her children for all the days of his life, she felt the same sense of rightness that had guided her through all the important decisions of her life. "You may kiss your bride," the minister said, and Daniel's kiss was gentle and sure, a promise of the partnership that would see them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The years that followed brought their share of hardships. Drought seasons that tested their resolve, floods that washed out months of careful work, market fluctuations that required creative solutions to keep the station profitable. But they also brought prosperity that neither could have achieved alone, and a happiness that grew deeper with each passing season. The small flock of sheep grew into a substantial operation. Daniel's knowledge of livestock and his contacts throughout the industry helped them improve their breeding stock and find the best markets for their wool. Maggie's careful management and her understanding of the land ensured that every resource was used efficiently, every opportunity maximized. Sarah grew into a young woman with her mother's quick intelligence and her stepfather's quiet strength. She married a young doctor from Adelaide and settled in town, but she visited often, bringing her own children to play in the gardens where she had learned to tend plants and care for animals. William, as Daniel had predicted, proved to have a natural gift for working with livestock. He took over much of the day-to-day operation of the station as he grew older, though he often sought his father's advice on difficult decisions. He married a teacher from Cougar Creek and built a house on the far edge of the property, close enough to help with the work but far enough away to maintain his independence. Baby James grew up thinking of Daniel as his father in every way that mattered, and the bond between them was as strong as any biological relationship could have been. He inherited Daniel's love of travel and eventually became a drover himself, though he specialized in shorter routes that allowed him to return home regularly to the woman he married and the children they raised together. As Maggie stood on a porch one evening in the spring of 1923, watching her grandchildren play in the yard while Daniel repaired a bridle nearby, she marveled at the turns life could take. 26 years earlier, she had been a desperate widow with 3 small children and no idea how she would survive another day. Now she was a matriarch of a thriving station, surrounded by family and blessed with a love that had grown stronger with each passing year. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked, setting aside his work to join her on the porch steps. At 69, his hair was silver and his movements a little stiffer, but his eyes still held the quiet intelligence that had first attracted her attention. "Just thinking about how different everything turned out from what I expected," she said, settling beside him with the ease of long partnership. "That morning when you first rode by and saw me struggling with the ram, I never could have imagined it would lead to all this." Daniel smiled, the expression carving familiar lines around his eyes. "Sometimes the best things in life are the ones we never see coming," he said, "like finding your home in a place you thought you were just passing through." As the sun set over the peaceful station, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that had become as familiar as breathing, Maggie reflected on the unexpected turns that life could take. She had learned that love could come more than once in a lifetime, that families could be built in many different ways, and that sometimes the very hardships that seemed designed to break us could actually lead us to our greatest happiness. The Australian Outback had tested her, challenged her, and ultimately rewarded her with more than she had ever dared to dream. In its vast spaces, she had found not just survival but abundance, of love, of family, of purpose. And in the quiet drover who had chosen to stay by her side, she had found a partner worthy of a life they had built together. For those of you who have followed Maggie's journey from desperate widowhood to flourishing partnership, I hope her story reminds you that it's never too late for a second chance at happiness, that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes our greatest challenges lead us directly to our greatest blessings. If this tale of resilience and love in the Australian Outback has touched your heart, please subscribe to hear more stories of courage and hope from times when life moved at a gentler pace. Give this video a like if you believe, as Maggie learned, that even when we think our story is over, life may have beautiful new chapters waiting to be written. And share in the comments below what stories of unexpected love and second chances have inspired you in your own life. Until our paths cross again, may you find the strength to weather your storms and the wisdom to recognize love when it appears on your horizon.